Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. Is Vladimir Putin looking to recreate the Russian Empire of the 1850s? Is he trying to reconquer all of those countries that when the Iron Curtain fell in 1990, became independent states, sovereign countries? Is Ukraine going to be the last place he attacks? Or is he going to turn and attack other countries? Is he going to turn and attack other sovereign states to recreate the empire he is looking for? We do know this, that Vladimir Putin recently issued a warning to the West and to those he calls traitors and scum. That warning was stark and very much so to the point. What can be done to stop him? Are the economic sanctions going to be enough? Do we need to do more? Missile strikes into Ukraine, a missile strike into a military base near Poland. What is Joe Biden, the UN, and NATO countries looking to do to stop him besides the economic warnings and sanctions? We look at the economic sanctions. There are a number of people that have aligned themselves with Putin that have found themselves losing properties, real estate, business deals, and alike because of that particular wanting to align themselves with Vladimir Putin. China looks like they're going to back down away from their alignment with Russia and the whole idea of going to war. Listen to the next few segments and figure out for yourself what it is that the West can do to stop him, how Ukraine can be helped, and how you feel about President Zelensky holding out to Russia.
As the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has now entered into its fourth week, the Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a stark warning to the dissenters and has called for natural and necessary cleansing of the Russian society. The Kremlin's leader said that the West was, of course, using the fifth column to try and divide the Russian society. He accused the Western allies of funding misinformation to cause civil friction so as to achieve its ultimate goal of Russia's destruction.
Безусловно, они будут пытаться делать ставку на так называемую пятую колонну, на национал-предателей, на тех, кто зарабатывает деньги здесь, у нас, а живет там. Коллективный Запад пытается расколоть наше общество, спекулируя на боевых потерях, на социально-экономических последствиях санкций, спровоцировать гражданское противостояние в России и, используя свою пятую колонну, стремиться к достижению своей цели. А цель одна, я уже говорил об этом – разрушение России.
The President Vladimir Putin has said that the Russian people will be able to distinguish between patriots and traitors. In a clear warning to those who are opposed to the war against Ukraine, he said that cleansing the Russian society of the Western Fifth Column will help strengthen its roots.
Но любой народ, а тем более российский народ, всегда сможет отличить истинных патриотов от подонков и предателей и просто выплюнет их, как случайно залетевшую в рот мушку, выплюнет на панель. Убежден, такое естественное и необходимое самоочищение общества только укрепит нашу страну.
The Russian leader Mikhail Kasyanov condemned President Putin's statement. He posted on Twitter saying, and I quote, "Putin is of course intensifying his actions to destroy Russia and is essentially announcing the start of mass repression against those who don't agree with the regime, adding that this has happened in our history before." Now remember, Kasyanov had served as Putin's first prime minister in early 2000s. The comments have come as Moscow has opened 3 criminal cases against people spreading what Kremlin is describing as fake news. The Russian Investigative Committee Law Enforcement Agency has said that the accused were actually guilty of spreading fake news against the Russian army on social media. The probes were in fact based on information from the FSB Secret Service, and the Russian authorities have confirmed the suspects' homes have been searched and movement on all suspects had been restricted. This after the Russian Duma had passed a law on the 4th of March making public actions aimed at discrediting Russia's army to be illegal and banning the spread of fake news and imposing a 15-year jail term on those who violate the law. The law also has alarmed Putin's political opponents as well as independent journalists working in the country who see the law as a bid to try and gag a reportage from ground and also to stagger the information flow to the Russian public. Meanwhile, the Russian media watchdog has blocked access to BBC's main news website, and the website of BBC's Russian service has also been blocked. This after Moscow's foreign ministry warned of more retaliatory measures against the media. The Roskomnadzor has also blocked access to at least about 31 other media websites inside of Russia, in what is being seen as a sharp crackdown on the ability of the Russians to access independent media. Moscow has also blocked all global tech giants, including Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. The Russian state television employee interrupted a live news program and held up a large sign that read, "No to war," and Russians are against the war. This was the sign that was shown by one of the Russian journalists inside who worked for the Russian state media. Now, the employee in the background who held up that placard that said "No to war," Marina Ovsyannikova of Russia's state-run Channel 1, was ordered to pay a penalty. Now, the United States, along with its allies, has criticized Kremlin's efforts to silence its dissenters. The U.S. State Department has also condemned the crackdown on the protesters and the journalists and has lauded the Russian citizens' efforts to stand up against Putin's war. And at least about 15,000 Russians have been detained by Moscow for expressing their opposition to Russia's invasion into Ukraine.
The 8,998th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Poland and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Mr. Rauf Mazu, Assistant High Commissioner for Operations, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, daily attacks continue to batter Ukrainian cities. Many are reportedly indiscriminate, resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Between 24 February and 15 March, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 1,900 civilian casualties. The total consists of 726 people killed, including 52 children, and 1,174 injured, including 63 children. The actual number is likely much higher. Most of these casualties were caused by the use in populated areas of explosive weapons with a wide impact area. Hundreds of residential buildings have been damaged or destroyed, as have hospitals and schools. OHCHR continues to monitor reports of civilian casualties in the whole country, including in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. OHCHR staff in Donetsk are closely following the developments regarding the 14 March incident in which 20 civilians were reportedly killed by a Tochka-U missile that may have contained cluster munitions. All such instances must be properly investigated. It is the responsibility of all sides to fully abide by their obligations to protect the lives of all civilians everywhere. OHCHR is gravely concerned about reports of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of civilians, local authorities, and civil society activists in Russian-controlled areas. We call for their immediate release. Mr. President, this week there were positive signals reported regarding the ongoing direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives. We welcome all such engagements. However, we note that these signals have so far not translated into the cessation of hostilities that is so desperately needed. The situation in the southeastern port city of Mariupol is particularly alarming. Many of the Mariupol residents who have not been able to safely evacuate lack food, water, electricity, and medical care. Uncollected corpses lie on city streets. Yesterday's strike on the Mariupol theater, which reportedly served as a bomb shelter for displaced civilians, adds to the list of attacks against civilian structures. While early reports indicate that the worst may have been avoided, ongoing fighting is hampering the rescue work and assessment of the situation. Mr. President, the devastation and suffering in Mariupol and Kharkiv raises grave fears about the fate of millions of residents of Kyiv and other cities facing intensifying attacks. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. Civilians are entitled to protection against the dangers arriving from military operations. Direct attacks on civilians are prohibited. Yet, the magnitude of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine cannot be denied. This demands a thorough investigation and accountability. Mr. President, the priority for the UN and its partners is to reach the people trapped by the ongoing shelling, including in eastern Ukraine. To that end, we continue to scale up our operations on the ground as circumstances permit. The needs of the population are growing by the day. The UN calls for safe passage for civilians from and humanitarian supplies into encircled areas. We are grateful to neighboring governments for their generosity in receiving refugees and enabling the provision of assistance to Ukraine. The UN is requesting all donors to fast-track funding against pledges made toward the Ukraine flash appeal. The appeal, which seeks $1.1 billion to help 12 million people in need, is 36% funded. Mr. President, UNDP projects that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war continue, setting the country and the region back decades and leaving deep social and economic scars. As the Secretary General highlighted, dangerous ripple effects of the conflict are already being felt across the globe. Russia and Ukraine represent more than half of the world's supply of sunflower oil and 30% of the world's wheat. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted. All of this is hitting the poorest the hardest and potentially creating instability around the globe. The Secretary General announced on 14 March the establishment of a global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance to lead an effort with member states to deal with the complex fallout of the war. The Deputy Secretary General will lead an interagency steering committee with partners to oversee this effort. Mr. President, the Secretary General welcomes all ongoing diplomatic contacts. He remains actively engaged with leaders who are trying to bring about an end to this war. There will be no winners to this senseless conflict. The tremendous loss it is causing, on the other hand, is heartbreakingly clear. And it is going to get much, much worse the longer the fighting continues. The Secretary General urges intensified and coordinated political efforts for an immediate cessation of hostilities. There must be a meaningful, sustained political process to enable a peaceful settlement. The lives of millions of Ukrainians and the peace and security of the entire region and possibly beyond depend on it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Raouf Mazou.
Mr. President, it has been less than 3 weeks since High Commissioner Grandi addressed this council. Within this short time span, the number of refugees from Ukraine in the neighboring countries has risen exponentially from the then 520,000 to over 3.1 million today, in what has become the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. With close to 2 million refugees from Ukraine, Poland has, in a matter of a few weeks, become one of the largest refugee hosting countries in the world. Some 490,000 people have fled to Romania, 350,000 to Moldova, 280,000 to Hungary, and 228,000 to Slovakia. Hundreds of thousands have now reached other European countries. A sizable number of people have also moved to the Russian Federation and to a smaller extent to Belarus. We are humbled by the remarkable resilience of the refugees, many of whom have left their home with next to nothing, and by the extraordinary hospitality of the host authorities and host communities. This solidarity illustrates the very foundation of the international refugee protection architecture and the spirit of the Global Compact on Refugees. The acts of compassion, humanity, and kindness we now witness daily bring hope and brighten an otherwise very grim reality. We strongly commend the governments of receiving countries for keeping their borders open to all those fleeing Ukraine, including third country nationals who must continue to be received without any discrimination. The robust response that these countries have mounted from scratch in an extremely short period of time is truly impressive. We are heartened by the bilateral and other support extended to the principal refugee hosting countries and the funding committed to us so far in support of the $1.1 billion US dollar flash appeal for the response inside Ukraine and for the $550.6 million US dollars towards the UNHCR-led regional refugee response plan, both launched on the 1st of March. The outpouring of support from the private sector and individuals who have jointly provided some 2/3 of the funds raised for the response so far must be lauded. All international support to the response is coordinated under the refugee coordination model led by UNHCR, which has been established in Poland, Moldova, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, as well as in other countries in the region. The sum of collective expertise and support will be critical to help the refugee population and support host countries with shelter, emergency relief items, cash assistance, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. UNHCR has scaled up its response by deploying over 200 experts and established field presence in all countries. UNHCR staff on the ground undertake regular protection monitoring at the main border crossing points, reception centers, and other locations where refugee transit or gather. However, with the current pace of refugee outflows, the capacity of neighboring countries are being tested and stretched. We can and must do more to support, and we must do it now. As the situation evolves, UNHCR, in coordination with the host governments and partners, will assess the needs as necessary and is currently adjusting the regional refugee response plan. While some refugees transit through countries neighboring Ukraine, many also join families which have long settled in these countries. This is particularly the case in Poland, where with time passing and resources diminishing, the number of refugees needing integration will rise. They and the state which hosts them will need support to ensure their inclusion in all sectors of public life, health and education, access to labor and other services. With EU host countries receiving support from the rest of the Union, we are particularly concerned about the situation in Moldova, where over 350,000 people have arrived. This refugee crisis comes on top of pre-existing challenges. It is therefore crucial that sufficient resources are made available quickly to support the government's response. As critical as it is, funding is only one of the many forms of support that are urgently needed. We commend the recent launch of the EU Solidarity Platform, designed to ease the pressure on the countries neighboring Ukraine through transfers of vulnerable refugees to the other EU member states. We are grateful to those member states that have already made concrete pledges to transfer refugees from Moldova and encourage others to join this initiative, which constitutes a remarkable and innovative example of responsibility sharing in line with the key tenets of the Global Compact on Refugees. In addition, the EU activated for the first time in its history the Temporary Protection Directive, which enables refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons to arriving in Ukraine to quickly regularize their legal status, alleviating pressure on asylum systems. It shall also enable refugees to find work, access services, and benefit from social protection. Such temporary protection has also been announced by the governments of the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Brazil, and others. Mr. President, I wish to further highlight that 90% of the refugees fleeing Ukraine are women and children, indicating the heightened risk of gender-based violence and other forms of exploitation and abuse, including trafficking. As the Secretary General said, for predators, human traffickers, and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. We are deeply concerned about media reports of incidents of gender-based violence and trafficking, and are supporting the efforts of government in scaling up prevention and risk mitigation measures, including through the Stay Safe campaign aimed at awareness raising and provision of information to refugees. As part of UNHCR's leading role in coordinating the UN refugee response, we have also deployed experts in PSEA coordinators to support the government's response in several refugee hosting countries. Mr. President, since the early days of this crisis, UNHCR committed to stay and deliver in Ukraine, and this is what we have done. Allow me to take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude and admiration for our colleagues who have remained in Ukraine, but also to the whole humanitarian community. We believe that at least 2 million people have been forced to flee within Ukraine. Close to 13 million people have been affected in the hardest hit area, hardest hit by the war in Ukraine. Many people remain trapped in areas of escalating conflict and, with essential services disrupted, are unable to meet even the most basic of their needs. In many locations, such as Mariupol, residents face a critical and potentially fatal shortage of food, water, and medicines. People living with disability or serious medical condition are particularly impacted. UNHCR is closely tracking negotiation for safe passage and is preparing to send humanitarian supplies as soon as conditions allow. To facilitate the provision of life-saving assistance to the population most in need in Ukraine, we have adjusted our operational presence, relocating offices and warehouses to the western and central part of the country. Together with partners, we have been able to deliver critical supplies for displaced and conflict-affected populations, including core relief items and shelter materials. We're working closely with local authorities to establish and expand reception capacity in main locations where internally displaced people arrive. We coordinate the provision of key protection services such as legal aid, social accompaniment, psychosocial support, child protection, and gender-based violence case management. Where conditions allow, we distribute multi-purpose cash to help people make choices best suited to their needs. Flexible forms of assistance are crucial, as are innovative approaches. Despite all efforts, we are unable to respond to the sheer scale of the rapidly growing needs of the Ukrainian people and systematically deliver the much needed life-saving assistance. We cannot overemphasize the urgent call repeatedly made by the Secretary General, USG DiCarlo, ERC Griffiths. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. International humanitarian law must be upheld, and safe passage for civilians in any direction they choose must be enabled. Safe humanitarian access to those in need and unhindered delivery of aid, including through a functioning humanitarian notification system, remains of paramount importance. Mr. President, in conclusion, allow me to paraphrase High Commissioner Grandi, who is today in Tajikistan after having left Afghanistan yesterday. On numerous occasions, he stressed that as we respond to the crisis in Ukraine, we cannot abandon or forget other recent and protracted humanitarian crises in many regions of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mazu for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address it today. The war in Ukraine is having a devastating consequence for the health of Ukraine's people, consequences that will reverberate for years or decades to come. There is severe disruption to health services and access to basic commodities as a result of widespread destruction of infrastructure, including health facilities. WHO has verified 43 attacks on health care, with 12 people killed and 34 injured, including health workers. In any conflict, attacks on health care are a violation of international humanitarian law. They deprive people of urgently needed care and break already strained health systems. The disruption to services and supplies in Ukraine is posing an extreme risk to people with cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, HIV, and TB, which are among the leading causes of mortality in Ukraine. Displacement, poor shelter, and overcrowded living conditions caused by the conflict are likely to increase the risk of diseases such as measles, pneumonia, and polio. Services for mental health and psychosocial support are urgently needed to help people cope with the effects of the war. There are more than 35,000 mental health patients in Ukrainian psychiatric hospitals and long-term care facilities, which are facing severe shortages of medicines, food, heating, blankets, and more. The war is also exacerbating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ukraine. With just 1/3 of the adult population fully vaccinated, this increases the risk of large numbers of people developing severe disease. Critical shortages of oxygen will have an impact on the ability to treat patients with COVID-19 and many other conditions. At least 8 facilities for producing and storing liquid oxygen have now closed. And we're seeking ways of accessing oxygen from neighboring countries and ways to deliver it safely to where it's needed. WHO is on the ground, working with the Ministry of Health and partners to support health workers and the health system to provide care to meet immediate health needs. So far, we have sent about 100 metric tons of medical supplies, including oxygen, insulin, surgical supplies, anesthetics, and blood transfusion kits, enough for 4,500 trauma patients and 450,000 primary healthcare patients for 1 month. Other equipment, including oxygen generators, electrical generators, and defibrillators, have also been delivered, and we're preparing to send a further 108 metric tons. We have now established supply lines from our warehouse in Lviv to many cities of Ukraine. But challenges with access remain. We need unfettered access. We have critical supplies ready for UN joint convoys to enter difficult areas, but so far we have not been successful. Today, for example, the UN convoy to Sumy that included a WHO truck carrying critical medical supplies was unable to enter. Loads ready for Mariupol remain in staging areas and cannot proceed. Access to this and other areas is now critical. To support Ukraine's health system, WHO is coordinating the deployment of 20 emergency medical teams consisting of experts from many countries to deliver care across a range of disciplines in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which have been generous in welcoming refugees but are struggling to meet their needs, as my colleagues earlier said. Those needs are immense and include continuity of care for basic illnesses, as well as more complex issues like cancer and renal dialysis, maternal and child health, HIV and TB, sexual and reproductive health, and mental health. Refugees and many of those who remain in Ukraine are already very vulnerable, especially women and girls. Protecting them from abuse and exploitation of all kinds must be a top priority for hosting governments and for all international organizations. Mr. President, today I have 3 urgent requests. First, we urge the Security Council to work for an immediate ceasefire and a political solution. Prolonged conflict is in nobody's interest and will only prolong the suffering of the most vulnerable. The life-saving medicine we need right now is peace. Second, we urge all donors to support the response to humanitarian needs in Ukraine and neighboring countries, which are immense and escalating every day. Thanks to donors who front-loaded WHO's contingency fund for emergencies, we were able to respond immediately, deploying These funds were supplemented by additional funding from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF. However, to sustain the response, we call on donors to fully fund the United Nations Emergency Appeal. As the Undersecretary General said, it's only 36% so far funded. We thank those donors who have already pledged funding to meet the needs of people in Ukraine. And third, although Ukraine is rightly the focus of the world's attention, I urge you not to lose sight of the many other crises in which people are suffering. In Afghanistan, more than half the population is in need, with widespread malnutrition and a surge in measles, among many other challenges. In Ethiopia, the blockade of 6 million people in Tigray for almost 500 days has created a catastrophic food and health crisis. In the Syrian Arab Republic, more than 12 million people are in need of health assistance, almost half of them children. And in Yemen, roughly 2/3 of the population, more than 20 million people, are estimated to be in need of health assistance. Mr. President, in every case, the only solution is peace. I repeat, in every case, the only solution is peace. And our world needs peace more than ever. As if COVID is not enough, to have a devastating war like this is dangerous for the world. I thank you, and back to you.
I thank Dr. Ghebreyesus for his briefing and give the floor now to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the briefers for your briefing today. Just 3 weeks ago, Russia launched its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable, full-scale invasion into Ukraine and assault on democracy. Now over 3 million refugees have fled the country, creating a devastating humanitarian crisis felt around the world. These refugees are mostly women and children. They stuffed their lives into backpacks and left their homes and everything they knew behind. Today, many of them know that their apartment buildings and streets have been bombed to rubble. And the horrors continue for those who remain in Ukraine. We just heard from the WHO DG that 43 hospitals have been attacked by Russia. 43 hospitals and health facilities. AP reporters on the ground showed the world a mass grave in Mariupol, a narrow trench filled with the bodies of children. Yesterday, Russian forces dropped a powerful bomb that hit a Mariupol theater where hundreds of civilians were hiding. The Russian word for children was written outside the theater, both front and back, in large white letters that could have been seen from the sky. Yet Russian forces bombed it anyway. Local officials have told families to leave their dead relatives lying outside on the streets, exposed to the world, because it is simply too dangerous with the bombs and shellings to hold funerals. I just met with Ukrainian civil society leaders. They reported that people standing in a bread line, trying to get food to feed their families, were shot dead by Russian soldiers. They reported terror, the terror that Russia is inflicting across Ukraine on the Ukrainian people. Russia will be held accountable for its atrocities. There's only one way to end this madness. President Putin, stop the killing, withdraw your forces, leave Ukraine once and for all. Yesterday, I listened to President Zelensky's speech to the United States Congress, and I was so moved by his words, his bravery, and his calls for help and for peace. Immediately afterward, President Biden announced another $800 million in security assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. That's more than $1 billion in the past week alone. We're not doing this by ourselves. Our allies and partners are fully committed to surging assistance to the Ukrainians. And we are grateful to all of our allies and partners who have opened their borders and their hearts and welcome Ukrainian refugees. We're also going to continue to provide humanitarian relief to support people within Ukraine and those who have been forced to flee, including the $186 million in additional assistance that Secretary Blinken announced on Tuesday. Here at the United Nations, we believe the best way to address the humanitarian crisis is through a resolution in the UN General Assembly. The resolution in the General Assembly will reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and Ukraine itself. The International Court of Justice issued a profound and important order yesterday to the Russian Federation, and we call on Russia to comply immediately. Russia has clearly violated international law by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's brutal tactics have killed civilians, medics, and some of the journalists who have been showing us all the truth of this war. Russia has attacked so much of what we hold sacred and everything the United Nations stands for. Russia's actions must be condemned in no uncertain terms. As President Biden said, Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin. No matter what advances he makes, no matter whom he kills or what cities he destroys, Ukraine will never be a victory for him. The United States stands with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people And we will do everything in our power to end this tragic, unnecessary war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement and give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Rosemary, for your clarity and the very valuable information you provide every time you come to brief the Council. Thank you, Mr. Mazou and Director General Ghebreyesus, for your sobering information. Dear colleagues, 3 weeks into this unprovoked, unjustified, illegal, and deadly aggression by Russia, and the terrible facts are hardly surprising since anticipated nearly to the detail. Massive casualties among civilians, mass graves, widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, ruined homes, schools, and hospitals, lives blown away by bombardments, children's dreams teared into smoke. There is no need to describe this devastating situation. Yet, as we just heard, and by the top UN representatives, not by the so-called West hysteria, is soul-wrenching and coincides with the shocking media reports on the horrors of the war and the misery unleashed upon Ukraine for no reason. I will maybe just recall the summarizing words of the Secretary General when he said 2 days ago, Ukraine is in fire and is being decimated. Guess by who? Over 3 million refugees in only 3 weeks, more than the entire population of my country. Some 2 million people displaced internally. 12 million people affected in the areas hardest hit by the war. UNICEF has evidence that since the start of the war, forced by this brutal aggression, every second a child has crossed the border of Ukraine. SRSG Patton warns that abuse, risks of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as trafficking, continue to mount amid wide-scale displacement. Several appeals for humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians went unheeded. Many people remain trapped in areas of conflict and with essential services disrupted are unable to meet their basic needs, including food, water, and medicine. For the estimated hundreds of thousands who remain, there is simply nowhere to go. They can be killed even for queuing for bread, as it happened. This is the angry and the true face of the Russian aggression. Mr. President, the director of WHO that we just heard confirmed that there have been 33 attacks on Ukrainian healthcare facilities, infrastructure, and workers since the beginning of the invasion, otherwise 2 every day. There are, unfortunately, nearly a dozen conflicts in the world today. Out of 89 attacks on health system around the world this year so far, 33 have been only in Ukraine. Therefore, attacking healthcare facilities and workers is becoming a tactic of war in Ukraine. Nothing is being spared. First, there was this maternity ward in Mariupol. Then there was a mosque. Yesterday, Russians bombed the drama theater in Mariupol, a shelter for nearly 1,000 citizens who were not able to flee the city. And as it was mentioned, the word children in large Russian script was painted on the ground outside the theater. Everything must be bombed. Despite this grueling picture, the main news is not just what I said. The main news is that Ukraine is holding on, that Ukraine is resisting, that Ukraine is winning and Russia is deep in the mud. On the ground, morally, legally, and internationally. And we know now that for Russia to win this war of choice, it has to Grozny the entire Ukraine. It has to Aleppo all its cities. It has to Mariupol everything there. And even after that, we will be told here again that it's not their fault. C'est la faute à Voltaire. Mr. President, Ukraine won yesterday the first legal victory at the International Court of Justice. ICJ, the guardian of international law, ruled that there was no evidence to support Russian claims that Ukraine was committing genocide in the Luhansk and Donetsk. The court called for immediate suspension of any kind of military operations by Russia and entities, organizations, or persons under its control. So the question is, will Russia respect the court's order, or will it unplug and cancel itself completely, entirely, from the international law? Mr. President, beyond the human toll, the infrastructure and residential deliberate destructions and large-scale humanitarian crisis, there is another major crisis, the economic impact of the aggression. UNDP has warned that every day of delayed peace will accelerate a free fall into poverty in Ukraine. UNDP again projected yesterday that 90% of the Ukrainian population could be facing poverty and extreme economic vulnerability should the war deepen. In the event of a continuing protracted war in Ukraine, almost 1/3 of the population will fall below the poverty line, and a further 62% will be at extreme risk of falling into poverty within the next 12 months. It warned, again the UNDP, that 18 years of social economic achievement could be lost. And this would set the country, an entire region, back decades, leaving deep social and economic scars for generations to come. Who in this room or outside it believes then a single word from Russia about SDGs, about Agenda 2030, because these terrible effects will not only be felt in Ukraine, but in the entire world? Mr. President, Russia has proposed a text for a humanitarian resolution. We think it is wrong. It is worst. It's a mockery of proportions, a move worth of the Guinness record of hypocrisy. Russia cannot shoot first and then come disguised as a doctor. The only way to minimize humanitarian consequences for the Ukrainian population is simple. Russia has to stop the war, withdraw its troops, and go home. No one should get confused by a text just because it is called humanitarian, when the only aim is to provide cover for the war. So colleagues, don't fall for the new clothes of the emperor. The Russian aggression is naked out there. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.